Cool Figure TV. Revolutionary salute. Revolutionary salute. Like, share, subscribe. Welcome to the House of Revolution. You know I'm your humble host, the Yao Mean of Revolution, and Putin unleashes the Poseidon. Game over. Before we get into that, be sure to wipe your feet. That means hit the like button. You in the House of Revolution. Like, share, subscribe, support the platform, y'all. Trump is helpless. Putin is tired of playing. It looks bad for NATO. Let's get into the content. Salute.
Russia's nuclear shadow has grown darker and louder. Just days after unveiling its Burevestnik missile, President Vladimir Putin has confirmed the successful test of another weapon, the Poseidon, a nuclear-powered underwater drone capable of striking NATO coastlines from the depths of the ocean. It's not just a weapon, it's a new era of deterrence. The Poseidon is built for one mission: to bypass all Western defenses. With a range of over 10,000 kilometers, it can travel silently beneath the surface for days or weeks, undetected by sonar. Its purpose: to deliver a nuclear payload large enough to create a radioactive tsunami capable of wiping out entire coastal cities. From London to New York, from Oslo to...
See, Putin warned them. He warned Trump. They keep talking tough and beating their chest. Okay, they're talking about war in Venezuela. Okay, you seem like a person who we can't negotiate with. I warned about the Poseidon. We did a video about this Russian weapon a year ago. People said it didn't exist. Oh, really? Well, what the hell did Putin just unleash this and tell them the test was successful? And they can unleash this in the water. Unmanned drone. It could be underwater for months. It could be underwater for infinite amount of time. You'll never know where it's at. But when it's activated, whatever coastline, if it's activated on the West Coast, that's the end of the West Coast. If it's activated on the East Coast, that's the end of the East Coast.
To Lisbon.
You should know this. Yesterday we conducted another test, this time of another advanced system, the Poseidon underwater unmanned vehicle, which also has a nuclear power unit. For the first time, we managed not only to launch it from its carrier submarine using the starting engine, but also to activate the nuclear power installation.
So you see what happened when you talk about giving Ukrainian neo-Nazis tomahawks? Trump was just talking tough about tomahawks, beating his chest. Putin just said, okay, guess what? We unleashing all of the unstoppable missiles that could be in the air for months at a time or underwater for months at a time, undetectable. If you think we bluffing, keep playing games. Surrender now, or it is what it is. That's what
under which the vehicle operated for a certain period of time.
Get into that.
This is a tremendous success.
Western analysts have warned for years that Poseidon could render NATO's maritime defenses useless. Unlike traditional ballistic missiles,
with this and the other missile he just released, it's nothing. They can't. The U.S. I've been telling people that they can't defend us. That's been a scam. NATO can't defend their citizens. That's been a scam. If NATO had the weapons that Russia had, they would wipe Russia ass off the map. They better be lucky a guy like Putin is in power right now with these advanced weapons. But what he's letting them know is it's no longer a theory. These weapons are activated. The army has their hands on them.
Missiles, it moves underwater, slowly, deliberately, impossible to intercept. And when it reaches its target, it could detonate near a harbor, generating a radioactive wall of water that engulfs everything in its path. Ports, naval bases, and civilian cities alike. Even a single detonation could make an entire coastline uninhabitable for decades. The message is aimed squarely at NATO, with Washington, London, and Paris coordinating nuclear posture reviews and strategic deployments. Moscow is reminding the West that its second strike capability now extends beneath the ocean floor. Poseidon isn't just a deterrent. It's a psychological weapon meant to make Europe's coastal capitals live under a new kind of fear. In his remarks, Putin tied the test directly to Russia's ongoing war, calling it part of the effort to strengthen defense capabilities and ensure that Russian soldiers' sacrifices have meaning. For Moscow, each battlefield gain and each new weapon test now feed into one doctrine: total strategic depth. Russia is telling the world that its reach is limitless across land, sky, and now the deep sea.
You are fighting on the front lines, risking your lives. And of course, you think about whether the country will carry forward what you have achieved, whether the nation will continue to move forward, strengthening its defense capabilities and growing stronger overall. These are also the kinds of elements connected to that work.
Across NATO capitals, intelligence agencies are now assessing what the Poseidon test means. Defense analysts believe it could neutralize maritime deterrence and undermine the US nuclear triad's sea-based leg. If deployed on Russia's Belgorod-class submarines, Poseidon could patrol near the Atlantic and Arctic coasts, giving Moscow strike options across both oceans without warning. Its range effectively places every NATO coastline within reach. Two nuclear systems tested in 4 days: Burevestnik and Poseidon, both powered by miniature nuclear reactors, both designed to bypass American missile shields, and both announced with one clear message: Russia is no longer deterred. It is daring NATO to blink first. The age of silent underwater terror has begun, and its name is Poseidon.
We're beginning some breaking news from Russia. A new wave is rising from the depths. Silent, unstoppable, and nuclear. Russia unveiled its latest doomsday weapon, the underwater drone POSEIDON. Russia has successfully tested a nuclear-capable, nuclear-powered underwater drone. This is Moscow's second test of a new nuclear weapons system in just a few days. President Putin confirmed the test, calling it a new generation strategic system with no possible interception.
Of another promising complex, the Poseidon unmanned underwater vehicle, also with a nuclear power engine.
This is not just another torpedo. Poseidon is a monster of the deep, over 20 meters long, first tested in 2018. It is capable of carrying a nuclear warhead of up to 2 megatons. It is designed to travel thousands of miles underwater, undetected, and strike with apocalyptic force. Powered by a miniature nuclear reactor, it can remain submerged for months, cruising beneath sonar, nets, and ocean defenses like a ghost. Its mission is to deliver a nuclear payload powerful enough to trigger radioactive tsunamis and wipe out entire coastal cities. Analysts are saying Poseidon is part of Russia's second strike deterrent, a weapon that can survive any nuclear exchange and still hit back, launched from submarines or hidden underwater silos. It transforms the ocean itself into a weapon platform. Putin on Sunday oversaw a test of another advanced nuclear-capable weapon, the Burevestnik cruise missile, which he said had an unlimited range. Trump called that exercise not appropriate.
Whenever Putin come out in his battle fatigues, he's serious business. He ain't come through.
Разрешите начать движение? Разрешаю.
The new weapons testing marks Russia's second major nuclear-capable system trial within days, doubling down on a new generation of super weapons. The undersea battleground has quietly become a front line in an unseen nuclear race that could redefine warfare and global security. Peter Kuznick is a professor of history and director of the Nuclear Studies Institute at American University. He is now joining us live on this broadcast. Professor, it's good to see you. The detail is in the message that Putin is trying to put out to the world. He's tested 2 nuclear-powered drones. We're talking about the Burevestnik and now this submarine. What do you think Putin is trying to do, and why is he doing these tests now?
You have to add to that the deployment of the Oreshnik missile back in November, and the announcement that the Sarmats are about to be deployed also. Putin is clearly sending a message. After the Budapest meeting between Putin and Trump collapsed, and then the indication that the United States has given authorization to Ukraine to use some of the American weapons to strike deep inside of Russia, including Moscow, Putin is making a very, very strong statement. Peskov had said that if they strike deep inside of Russia, if Ukraine strikes deep inside of Russia, the effect could be devastating, that Russia is going to respond very, very decisively. So Putin is making clear that if Trump does not accept Putin's offer to extend the New START treaty for another year when it expires this coming February, then Russia is going to continue deploying these terrifying nightmare science fiction-like nuclear weapons and missiles that would be simply inconceivable, the destruction that they could wreak.
Professor, what's your view on the Burevestnik and now the Poseidon? Because apparently they can, withstand the speed, they can stay on the air, they can stay undersea for days, very quickly.
In Putin's State of the Nation message, May 1st, 2018, he announced that Russia had 5 new nuclear weapons, all of which could circumvent U.S. missile defense. That seems to be the case. When the Oreshnik was tested, former U.S. National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster said that the U.S. would not have a response for at least 15 years. So Putin is in some ways getting ahead of the United States. Trump talks about this Golden Dome missile defense system. Well, this is going to make a mockery of Trump's plans. So what the world needs to do clearly is step back off this precipice, because we're getting closer and closer to the nightmare scenario that we've all dreaded for most of our lifetimes.
All right, Professor Kuznick, it's good to see you. We'll have to end it there. Thank you for talking to us today.
Thank you for having me.
How long y'all thought Putin was just going to be talking? They say he bluffing. Well, he letting them know, I'm finish off the Nazis in Ukraine. If y'all keep talking about giving them weapons to destroy Russia, then I'm going to destroy all of y'all cities, and I'm going to hit all of y'all military bases. And there's nothing y'all can do about it. He's basically letting them know that, and letting the whole world know that.
Guys, come in. Come in. Sit down.
Come in, come in. Sit down. The
Doctor just said that you all have a birth. And I want to emphasize something. I've said it many times before and I say it consciously and with full justification. Everyone who is in the special military operation zone at the front, in the war, they are all behaving heroically. You understand, they can fly in at any second or anywhere. That's it. But still, assault troops, special forces and military reconnaissance, people like you, it still requires special training, it requires a special character. These are obvious things, simply obvious. And I am very pleased to note that we have a big thank you. Well, you know, your efforts are not in vain. The overall situation in the Special Military Operations Zone is shaping up favorably for us. Our combat comrades are advancing at all levels, actively operating in 2 locations, as you know, as we've publicly stated. In 2 locations, in Kupiansk and Krasnoarmeysk, the enemy has been encircled. Incidentally, I discussed this issue with the commanders of the relevant groups. They wouldn't object, Ranovich, to allowing media representatives, foreign journalists, and, well, Ukrainian journalists, into the enemy encirclement zones so they could go in and see with their own eyes what's happening, and verify the state of the encircled troops.
Now, pay attention to what he just said. This should be all over the news. They don't want to talk about this. He say, since they lie so much and say I'm lying, I'm willing to let the journalists come in to the area and see that we have all of these Ukrainian soldiers surrounded. They not going nowhere. If they move, we're going to kill them. But we want them to surrender. Zelensky need to tell these people to do the right thing. But we're willing to let the journalists come see these people. This is supposed to be all over the news. Putin says he has 10,000 or more Ukrainians surrounded. Is it true or is it not true?
We want Ukraine's political leadership to make an appropriate decision regarding the fate of its citizens and its service members, as they once did at Azovstal.
See, what Putin knows is it's a bunch of NATO officers surrounded also, because this was a very strategic, important town. The whole line is collapsing. It's all over for him. But this is what he's doing, is he letting the world know we had it. He really, NATO is surrounded. They better surrender or it's going to be bad news. That's what he's saying. And he's saying we're willing to let the world press come in and see this so they can't lie and say it's not true.
They will have that opportunity. Our only concern is that there are no provocations from the Ukrainian side. We are prepared to cease hostilities for a certain period of time, for several hours, 2, 3, 6 hours, so that journalist groups can enter these settlements, see what's happening, talk to Ukrainian servicemen, and then leave. We are prepared to bring them to certain points so that Ukrainian servicemen
then leave. You get to see, you see them? They trapped. It's 10,000 of them. They're not going nowhere. Plenty NATO in there. We got them surrounded. Heavy weapons. There's no busting out of this. If they even move 1 inch, they did. That type of surrounded. Then you leave. No negotiations. We will not be negotiating for these soldiers. No. These are captured. You haven't seen this type of humiliation since World War II.
On the other side can receive them. The most important thing is to avoid provocation on the Ukrainian side. We don't want a drone to fly in, so that none of these journalists are harmed, and then they try to blame us for this incident. We don't need that. On the contrary, we are prepared to do everything as I'm saying now. The only question is whether the Ukrainian side is ready for this. This is the first thing I wanted to say. You are fighting with dignity, but in your own sector. This is obvious, but I think what's more important to you is what's happening overall on the line of contact, on the front line, and that's where the situation will develop. Well, what you're doing, what your comrades in arms, our soldiers and officers are doing, this is the most important thing the country is currently doing, ensuring its security and the security of our people for the long term. Well, no less important is that while we're solving these critical current problems, we're also not forgetting about improving and strengthening our strategic potential. You've probably heard that a new, cutting-edge missile with an unlimited range and a nuclear propulsion system was tested just recently. It has undeniable advantages. We can be proud of the achievements of our scientists, specialists, engineers, workers who made all this happen. The advantage is that it's a small nuclear propulsion system. With comparable power to, say, a nuclear submarine's nuclear reactor, it's 1,000 times smaller than a nuclear reactor on a submarine. 1,000 times smaller, but that's not even the most important thing. The most important thing is that while a conventional nuclear reactor starts up in hours, days, or weeks, this nuclear reactor starts up in minutes and seconds. This is a truly enormous achievement. We'll also be able to apply this to the national economy. We'll be able to use it in the future to address energy security in the Arctic, and we'll use it in the lunar program. And even now, the radiation protected. Electronics used in the Borvesnik rocket are already being used in space programs. So this is a breakthrough not only in enhancing the country's defense capability, but also in science as a whole, in the national economy, and in the future. But that's not all. You should know this. Yesterday, another test of another promising complex was conducted. This is the underwater unmanned underwater vehicle Poseidon. Also with a nuclear power plant. For the first time, we managed to not only launch it from a carrier submarine using its booster engine, but also start the nuclear power plant, which the vehicle was on for a certain amount of time. This is a huge success because, well, besides all the advantages I mentioned regarding the log-shaped device, it also has minimal dimensions. Here, if it's 1,000 times smaller than a nuclear reactor on a submarine, here it's 100 times smaller than a nuclear reactor on a submarine. But the Poseidon's power significantly exceeds the power of even our most advanced intercontinental range missile, the Sarmat. There's nothing like the Sarmat in the world. And we don't have one on duty yet. It will be on duty soon. But Poseidon is significantly more powerful than the Sarmat. And, besides, in terms of speed and depth of movement of this unmanned vehicle, there's nothing else like it in the world. It's unlikely to appear anytime soon, and there are no methods of intercepting it. That's it. Well, I think this is important to you too, right? You're fighting there on the front lines, risking your lives, and of course, you're wondering why you're doing it. To what extent will the country be willing to embrace what you're doing, risking your lives and health, defending the homeland? Yes, To what extent will it be able to continue moving forward, strengthening its defenses, and generally becoming stronger? Well, these are also elements related to this work. Thank you very much again. So, if anyone wants to say anything, please, say it. If not, then we'll ask the camera to move away and then we'll just have a heart-to-heart talk.
After Zelensky, sources working for Ukraine's main intelligence directorate began to acknowledge the massive presence of Russian armed forces in Pokrovsk, along disinformation from Ukrainian commanders about the situation. Pokrovsk was overwhelmed by the number of Russian troops and took advantage of defensive weaknesses in the southern part of the city, realizing the numerical superiority of the infantry. A special role was played by the lies of several Ukrainian brigade commanders who maintained the defense in southern Pokrovsk, admitted sources on October 29. It seems that Kiev has orders from NATO down to the last Ukrainian, but it's not that simple. As in the footage, the Ukrainian prisoners were captured outright, or they surrendered and the will to live overcame the fear of Pokrovsk's closed doors. On the inscription at the entrance in the northwestern part of the city, the Russian flag is now displayed there, where Zelensky previously took a photo. The footage was published by the Ukrainian journalist itself. Currently, not only are there hundreds of Russian troops, they are also laying ambushes on every movement, mining roads, and engaging in combat with rear units of electronic reconnaissance, electronic warfare, pilots, artillery, mortars, and others. UAV operators have entered the southern part of the city and are actively operating. As in the footage, another group of Ukrainian nationalists was knocked out while trying to leave the city. They tried to escape by running from house to house, but were spotted by Russian scouts. As soon as they stopped, they were immediately destroyed by Russian attack drones. Besides that, fiber optic drones carry out ambushes on light vehicles, track their targets, and attack once they are in range. Worst of all, Russia has cut off logistics to Murnorad and the entire agglomeration, Ukraine wrote. Nevertheless, President Vladimir Putin proposed temporarily suspending military operations in Pokrovsk, including Kupiansk, to allow foreign journalists to enter and prove the siege against the armed forces of Ukraine. This move will prevent the Ukrainian army from liquidating civilians, as they did when they lost settlements. The situation in the special military operations is developing well for us, Putin told Russian soldiers.
As the disclosure of the Burevestnik missile, the new nuclear-powered missile by the Russian side that they have unveiled, is that going to change the course of the war? Is that going to change the mentality and the thought process and the decision making of both the American, the Ukrainian, the European, and maybe even the Russian mentality in terms of whether this war is going to continue on being fought or whether they're finally going to reach a negotiated settlement? It's more complicated than it may appear, but it is also more concerning than it appears. And we're going to try and break all this down. We have with us back after a bit of a hiatus. I'm very grateful to have Alexander Mercurius back with us, the co-host of the Duran YouTube channel at Alex Mercurius. And we are very grateful to see you back. Well, welcome back.
Thank you very much. And I'm delighted to be here again, I must say.
Always a pleasure. I'm always eager to get your take on a lot of these things here, and I just want to start off with this Burevestnik, because I think that is certainly, you hesitate to use the term game changer, but even the mentality, because it's not literally new, it's just newly tested, but the fact that it is now presented on the I guess it's part of the fabric of all the things that are going on talking here. It does have the feel that has changed the conversation. Maybe that's a better way to put it. And I want to play something from Vladimir Putin earlier today when he was talking to some wounded soldiers, where he highlighted some of the utility and some of the advanced capabilities of this missile.
You've probably heard that a new, cutting-edge missile with an unlimited range and a nuclear propulsion system was tested just recently. It has undeniable advantages. The advantage is that it's a small nuclear propulsion system. The most important thing is that while a conventional nuclear reactor starts up in hours, days, or weeks, this nuclear reactor starts up in minutes and seconds. This is a truly enormous achievement.
So, according to this Burevestnik, it is a cruise missile, not too much different than even the U.S. Tomahawk cruise missile, except that it has a nuclear propulsion, which basically means it has unlimited range, and it can fly from literally anywhere. It can maneuver. It can do all kinds of things. And its claim is that it makes it nearly impossible to intercept. But let me just ask what you actually think about this, because in terms of the overall nuclear deterrence, I mean, there was already nuclear parity. There's already, from the normal ICBMs that the Russians had, or their tactical nuclear weapons, their nuclear triad. I mean, there was already so that didn't add anything to the deterrent value, but it has added something, I guess, to the technological. What do you make of this missile?
Well, if what we've been told about it is true, and I have no reason to doubt that it is true, then this is indeed a major technological advance. I am not an engineer or a technical person, but I understand that the Russians' success in apparently miniaturizing a nuclear reactor is remarkable. And apparently in Norway, they monitored this test, and they found no radioactive contamination as a result of it, which suggests that whatever this nuclear reactor, however it works, and I don't know anybody who's explained how it works, it seems to work on some kind of closed cycle system. So technologically, this is a breakthrough. As a weapon, well, I'm going to say it, I find it very, very frightening and extremely destabilizing, because as you rightly say, we already have nuclear strategic parity, but now we have a missile that seems to be almost designed to be as destabilizing as possible. It can fly towards the United States from any direction. It is apparently very difficult to track. It is apparently a system that can loiter, so it can presumably operate over the seas and oceans, or the Arctic Ocean, or wherever, undetected or perhaps even unsuspected for lengthy periods of time. I can imagine that in a time of tension, if these weapons become deployed, if the United States becomes aware that the Russians are launching these things and that they're loitering around and wherever, I can imagine how well the effect of that is going to have on intensifying tensions. I mean, it's going to raise them, I would have thought, to stratospheric levels. And this latest other system that the Russians have now deployed, the POSEIDON nuclear-powered submarine drone, I would say that that is equally alarming system. Now, the Russians are doing this because they sense that they've long sensed that they're in a position of geographical disadvantage relative to the United States, because the United States is able to operate cruise missiles and such missiles close to Russia, base them on land in Europe and that kind of thing. So it makes a kind of strategic sense for the Russians to develop them. And the Russians have also talked about how these would be second strike weapons if the United States were able to launch an attack on Russia. Then these weapons would be capable of striking the United States after a second strike. But to my mind, the fact that these weapons have been developed and are apparently going to be deployed now is testament of the very dangerous situation we are in, with the collapse of arms control. The New START treaty is due to expire in February. There are no negotiations between the United States and Russia about nuclear weapons. The entire structure of arms control and arms limitation, which I think both of us grew up with during the Cold War, has effectively collapsed. And we can see that these weapons, these very dangerous and very destabilizing weapons, are now starting to appear. I think the United States should urgently seek to discuss these weapons with Russia and should urgently agree with the Russians a one-year extension of the START treaty, which the Russians, by the way, have offered, and that we should see about how we can bring this whole business of arms control and nuclear weapons back under control again, so that we avoid the disaster that we seem to be sliding towards.
Yeah, we actually had Russian Ambassador Polyansky on the show, who made that exact statement on our show, that yes, they want to get back into arms reduction treaties. They want to have an extension of the START so that they can then have all the relevant experts then spend the following or that subsequent year to actually come up with a new system that would then go on indefinitely. And we're certainly huge supporters of that. I mean, why anybody on the planet Earth would not be is beyond me, but we'd like to get to it. For those, though, who may not know, a lot of people have been talking about the Burevestnik missile because that's been kind of in the news a lot the last couple of days. But some may not know what the Poseidon is. Let me show for our viewers here something that Putin also said earlier today about the Poseidon.
You've probably heard that a new, cutting-edge missile with an unlimited range and a nuclear propulsion system was tested just recently. It has undeniable advantages. The advantage is that it's a small nuclear propulsion system. The most important thing is that while a conventional nuclear reactor starts up
Gary,
in
I think that's
hours,
the one we
days,
played already. We're
or
looking for the other one,
this
the one on the
nuclear
Poseidon.
reactor starts up in minutes and seconds. This is a truly enormous achievement.
Just yesterday, there was another test of a future weapons system, and that's an unmanned submarine, Poseidon, with a nuclear power plant. There are no rivals to it, and there are no ways of intercepting it.
And for those who may not know, so that's, again, apparently used the same baseline technology of a nuclear propulsion as well. And what the Poseidon does is it's this and it's an unmanned, it's kind of like a submarine or a torpedo, a huge one that has a nuclear weapon on board. It will then fly near a coastal area like you're seeing depicted here on New York. It will explode, detonate under the sea, and then it will create a tidal wave that will then swamp the area, covering it with nuclear fallout and all kinds of things, making it uninhabitable. It's just a really terrifying weapon because there's literally no way that you can see it. At least with missiles, you can track them coming in. With these submarines here, you can't tell where they're at. You don't even know anything's coming in there. So it is one of the more frightening technologies that we've seen. As far as I know, we don't have any, but it's combined with the Burevestnik, this is a real trouble.
Absolutely. And I think what the reason the Russians are moving towards developing these systems is because of what we discussed previously, the fact that the system of arms control has broken down. The Russians have always been extremely sensitive, understandably, about American plans to deploy medium-range missiles that can reach Russia, Moscow itself, in Europe. They were unhappy about that in the early 1960s when it was done with the Jupiter missiles at that time. And that was one of the factors, by the way, that led up eventually to the Cuban Missile Crisis. President Kennedy wisely decided to withdraw those missiles. Then the United States and the European countries moved forward in the 1970s and 1980s to deploy nuclear-equipped Tomahawk missiles and Pershing II missiles in Europe in the 1980s. That also created a major crisis at the time. Again, President Reagan very wisely negotiated the Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty with the Soviets at that time, and that whole class of weapons was eliminated. Now we've pulled out of the INF Treaty. There are rumors and talk about us deploying weapons, similar weapons, to Europe again. The Russians are again extremely alarmed about this. And I think they see these weapons that they've developed now, the Poseidon and the Burevestnik, as counters to future American developments of deployments of medium-range missiles in Europe, particularly hypersonic missiles, which have been talked about. So what we need to do is to get into a negotiation with the Russians and trade these missiles off. Do what Presidents Kennedy and Reagan did in the past. Yes. And it seems to me obvious.
Well, it certainly it would appear that way. That's if people were thinking rationally and logically, that probably would already have happened. The fact that it hasn't is itself alarming because it shows that we're not thinking rationally. And then when you overlay that on top of what we're doing with the war itself between Russia and Ukraine, I mean, it can't help but add another layer of concern. And let's take a look at that, Dale, because you can't take view one without the other, because these things are all inextricably interwoven. And with the United States especially, okay, so I think since the last time you and I talked, the plan was, Russia and the United States with Trump wanted to get together and have this conversation with Putin. It said, hey, how's about we have our foreign ministers meet together and then we'll get together in in Hungary and in Budapest, and then we'll bring this thing to an end. And then that didn't even last but a few days and started falling apart almost right away. And now then all of it's on hiatus. No one's talking about it. And so apparently Trump, feeling frustrated, said, all right, tell you what, I'm going to now put some huge new sanctions on there. So he had two the Russia's biggest oil companies put the sanctions on there, et cetera. A lot of the claims are that both India and China will abide by some of them. I'll believe it when I see it, but that's some of the early reports. But the question is that going to be putting pressure on Russia to finally bring them to their knees? Now, according to U.S. NATO Ambassador Whitaker, he seems to think yes.
The president's point is very clear, is that we expect now with these enormous sanctions that have been placed on Lukoil and Rosneft, that this will maybe be the thing to unlock President Putin coming to the table and ending this war and at least entering into a ceasefire so we can, negotiate a final resolution. But remember, as I've said before, President Trump holds all the cards. This is just one card that he's playing. There are many more.
He holds no cards at all.
A lot of trouble with that statement right there. We're going to take it in two parts. First of all, let's take a look at the first thing that he says there is that these sanctions will finally bring Russia to the table. Now, as I think you and I have discussed probably every time we've ever talked about negotiated settlement, Russia's never left the table. They're still at the table. But when Whitaker says that, and when all of the Europeans say that, and definitely Ukraine, what they mean is that comes to the table and then is going to give Ukraine what it wants and Europe what it wants, which Russia's, I don't think, going to do. How do you see it?
No, of course, absolutely. I mean, can I just say, I mean, not only were the Russians always at the table, but I mean, it's a strange thing to say something like that when it's the United States that has cancelled a meeting between its president and the Russian president, between Putin and Trump. But anyway, put that aside. I've heard this narrative about, we'll impose more sanctions on the Russians, and we're going to get the Russians to capitulate, because that's exactly what it means. I mean, come along to the table and give Ukraine everything that it wants, or at least, if not what it wants, a freeze of the conflict, which will keep everything frozen so that Ukraine presumably can rearm in the future. That's what the Russians fear. And the war can resume again in some other form in 4, 5, 8 years, 10 years' time, whatever. What the Russians, anyway, have always rejected. The Russians are not going to agree to this. And they have not agreed to this after every previous round of sanctions. Why Mr. Whitaker and other people in the United States believe that these additional sanctions are going to change the Russian calculus, I simply do not understand. I mean, even if they were to have some impact on the Russian economy, which perhaps they might, is it really going to be enough to make the Russians change their policies? I mean, I don't know of any war that has been successfully brought to a stop in that way. The way you end wars is through negotiations with the other side, in which you address their concerns, not by putting sanctions on them all the time.
See, part of the problem, though, is President Trump has a number of times here in the last couple of weeks, especially, said that he believes that it's the tariffs or sanctions that have brought all these other wars that he claims to have supported or ended. He says up to 8 of them now. He says, oh yeah, sanctions are, and tariffs were a big part of that. That got them to do it. He actually goes into some detail. It says, yeah, so because some of these parties, when I said we're going to have sanctions on you guys if you don't agree to it, and then they said, oh, well, we don't want that, so we'll agree to it. I don't know if he's just saying that for public consumption, or the worst scenario, he actually believes it. But if he does, then he may think that this is actually going to make a difference this time.
Well, as I said, this is not going to work with this war. I mean, there's no way that it will. I mean, putting economic pressure on the Russians is not going to make the Russians more accommodating. It is going to make them less accommodating. The Russians were already very upset by the fact that the Budapest summit was called off in the way that it was. Apparently, they say that it was President Trump who proposed it. Putin agreed to it. And then suddenly the Americans call it off and impose sanctions instead. That's made the Russians feel very angry. And I don't think that's going to change. And if you look at not just the rhetoric in Moscow, but the mood there, there's no doubt at all that it's hardened over the last week. And for the record, I follow very closely what is going on in the Russian economy. The ruble has barely shifted. The stock market is stable. Economic conditions seem to be as stable as always. There is little evidence that this is having any big panic effect in the financial markets. The Russians seem very confident that they can ride this out. And expectation suggests that they're right. Experience rather suggests that they're right.
So one of the second thing that Ambassador Whitaker said in that soundbite was that Trump has a lot of cards that he can play here. He has a lot of leverage. Do you see it that way?
No, I don't actually. I think on the contrary, that the more he plays this game, the less leverage he has. And of course, the risk is that as more sanctions are applied, the less effective they become. And to the extent that there is any leverage, it diminishes. This is what has already been true with the sanctions that have been imposed already. If we'd spoken about sanctions 20 years ago, if you threatened the Russians with disconnection from the SWIFT payment system and told them that you were going to stop buying their gas, the Europeans were going to stop buying their gas, that would have had a big impact in Moscow. People would have said, this is serious. What are we going to do? After so many sanctions have already been applied, and none of them has had the effect on the Russian economy that people in the West and maybe some people in Russia expected, the effect of this diminishes with every time this card is played. I would add that I think it is all but inconceivable that China will stop buying Russian oil. China can easily, it consumes so much oil, it can replace any oil that India doesn't buy. I mean, it has the capacity to do that. I've spoken to people in the oil industry. India almost certainly will continue to buy some oil from Russia. Probably they will work out schemes to continue to trade with each other, the oil trade with each other, because as we've discussed in previous programs, it is very much in India's advantage to do so. And Putin is due to visit India in a few weeks. He's going in December. India and Russia, by the way, have just concluded yesterday a deal whereby India will build Russian civil airliners in India. There's going to be a co-production agreement. India, for all sorts of reasons, will want to preserve its relationship with Russia because it is both in its economic and its strategic interests to do so. So there will be a hit in the sense that there will be less demand for Russian oil for a few months. Then everything will gradually rearrange itself. We will have all the usual workarounds developed, and eventually things will go back to normal.
But the bottom line is, whatever pain it may have, it's not going to change any behavior by the Russian side or make them suddenly not care about core issues.
No, that's exactly the point. That's the key point.
So if we're going to look and say, all right, well, the diplomatic / sanctions economic front, that's not working very well, then what about on the battlefront? Because apparently, according to Ambassador Whitaker, in that same front, Russia's not succeeding there either.
President Trump has impressed on all of us, including our allies, is this war needs to end, and Russia needs to come to the table and resolve this dispute, resolve this war. They've made no progress in the last 3+ years of fighting. They still only control about 20% of Ukraine, and they're not, going to accomplish much more, even if they continue to fight for years. And so the time is now to end this war.
So I guess we're just trying to do Russia a solid, trying to help you out here, man, because you haven't done anything in 3.5 years. And even if you fight for years knowing it's just not going to work, how do you think the Russians see that calculation?
Well, I think they're getting very frustrated. And if you go back to the telephone call that President Putin had with President Trump, one of the things that Putin tried to explain to President Trump over the course of that call is that the information that President Trump appears to be getting about the military situation is wrong. It's there, actually. It's unusually, surprisingly there in the Russian readout. Now, the Russians do not feel that the war is in stalemate. If you go to the Russian media, if you go to the Russian internet, if you go to Russian social media, the mood there is of growing self-confidence. They sense that the Ukrainians are weakening, that they're short of men, that they're short of machines, that the West is finding it increasingly difficult to replace the machines, that they've established dominance in the air with their major drone and missile offensive, that they're now breaking through in the last big line of defense in Donbass itself, and that they're advancing steadily towards the Dnieper in the west. So the mood in Russia is completely different from the one that Ambassador Whitaker imagines. And I don't mean here the Kremlin and the Russian government. I mean wider Russian public opinion. They sense that the war is going in their favor. It's been a long and hard war, but they believe that if not exactly on the brink of victory, at least they are making significant progress and victory is starting to draw closer. However, victory in Russia is defined, about which, by the way, I should say, many people in Russia have different views.
You know, you talk about different interpretations of the exact same events.
Yeah.
Part of the other conversation that Putin had with some of his troops, as well as some of his generals here in the last couple of days, was that there are two areas, one in Kupiansk in the north on the eastern front and another one in Pokrovsk, that he says, you know what, we have a lot of their troops surrounded. He got a briefing from his commanders the other day, and that was actually mentioned at a previous episode.
In two locations, in Kupiansk and Krasnoarmeysk, the enemy has been encircled. Incidentally, I discussed this issue with the commanders of the relevant groups. They wouldn't object, Ranovich, to allowing media representatives, foreign journalists, and, well, Ukrainian journalists, into the enemy encirclement zones so that they could enter and see with their own eyes what's happening, and verify the state of the encircled troops.
For anybody who's made aware, the Russian version of the city is called Krasnoyarsk, which we call Pokrovsk here. So he's talking about Pokrovsk and Kupiansk. And there's lots of information out there that a lot of people on the Ukraine and the Western side are saying they're not surrounded. That's completely untrue. And so Putin seems to be putting his money where his mouth is and says, how about you guys send your journalists out here? We'll have a ceasefire, a local ceasefire in the areas, and you can come in and see for yourself and figure out what you're going to do. I have seen earlier today, and by the way, I'm going to do a whole show on this for our viewers here on this tactical situation where the Pokrovsk especially is near collapse, and along with Kupiansk, there's serious problems going on up there. And from a number of different sources, I'm going to be talking about that today. But one of the ones that I'm not referring to there, but will hear, is that on the Ukraine Telegram channels, there is significant alarm in the headquarters in not Kursk, in Kiev, that they are greatly worried that they have to start withdrawing their troops really fast, or they could literally lose 7,000 to 10,000 of them, that they could get cut off there. So it appears to be taken pretty seriously in the Ukraine command center. And you've seen with whether it's Bakhmut or some of these other cities that they've had over the course of this war, that they almost never withdraw their troops until it's too late, and then they end up getting destroyed in place. The fact that they're talking about it right now, that they may have to conduct, and we're talking within the next 24, 48 hours, a major withdrawal from the area, or they could lose even more of their troops. How do you see that?
Well, I think that's absolutely right. I'm going to watch your program, by the way, with great interest and anticipation. But everything that you have said is borne out by what I myself have been seeing. You're absolutely correct. If you look at the Ukrainian Telegram channels and you look at the Russian ones, they're all telling the same story. And it is the one that Putin is setting out in his comments to the soldiers, which is in both Pokrovsk and in Kupiansk. The Russians have significant Ukrainian forces surrounded. Now, I don't know how many exactly. Some people in Russia said 10,000 men altogether in the two places. Others put it rather less than that. I'm not going to try and guess, but undoubtedly an encirclement is taking place, and both of these two towns are going to fall. I think that people who think otherwise are wrong. And I think, by the way, something else, in the West, people take far too much of their information, I think, from the official Ukrainian government. And I'm not going to be very critical here, by the way. War is, something where, you have to sometimes say things that are less than the truth to others in order to keep them on side and things like that. But you should never assume that what the Ukrainians are telling you is completely true, just as you should never assume that what the Russians are telling you is necessarily true. But if you go to the medias, the social medias of these countries, then you get a very different impression of the state of the war. And this time, Social media on the Russian side is confident. Social media on the Ukrainian side is panicking, and they're getting their information from their friends in the army, from their contacts in the Ukrainian military, from people like that who are in a position to know.
And you can add to that from the West, Julian Rupka, which I know you and I've mentioned several times, is one of the more accurate and definitely pro-Ukraine. You see, he actually has the Ukraine flag in his name there. But he says with Pokrovsk and now Mirgorod, which is the sister city of the Pokrovsk pocket, heavily occupied by Russian forces, with more and more logistic routes under Russian infantry control, with increasing risk of major encirclement, the Ukrainian military leadership continues to deny the severity of the situation. No words, he says right there. So that's got to tell you something. Somebody who's definitely for the Ukraine side himself is calling out this unwillingness to talk publicly, officially, about what's actually going on there, because that doesn't help anyone. That doesn't help anyone on the Ukraine side to continue to pretend like things are otherwise, whether that's the Ukraine side or whether it's the U.S. ambassador who's like said, yeah, they haven't done anything. And you may recall, I think it was last month, where Emmanuel Macron said he also mocked the Russians that they hadn't gained in the last 2 years any more than 1% additional. Like that, it's no big deal. And actually, Donald Tusk actually said in the last 24 hours, after a conversation with Zelensky, he goes, don't worry about it. Ukraine can keep fighting for years, 2 or 3 years in the future. So we just need to keep giving them more ammunition and weapons, and everything will be fine. Everything won't be fine. And I'm not convinced. As a matter of fact, let's actually pull up a comment from one of your countrymen there at the Times in London, where Roger Boyce says, hey, I'm not even sure they're still going to be there in the spring. Yeah. Kiev might not even last until the spring. How significant is this for another quite very pro-Ukrainian person now in the UK media here, for him to say this?
Well, can I first of all say, Julian Röpke, with whom I disagree about many things, about many facts about the war, is nonetheless, in my opinion, an outstanding war correspondent. I mean, he has generally reported things as they are. If he is saying that the situation in Pokrovsk is close to encirclement, then you can say definitely that we are looking at a military crisis. Roger Boyce is the foreign news editor of the London Times. He is one of the most established figures in British journalism. He is a strong supporter of Ukraine, somebody who is extremely critical of the Putin government. That's putting it mildly. And somebody who is extremely well connected in British government circles and undoubtedly talks to people in the British political and military establishment who know about the true situation on the battlefronts. If Roger Boyce is saying that Kiev might not survive until the spring, that is something you should take extremely seriously. And on these points, I have to say, I believe Julian Röpke, I believe Roger Boyce above Ambassador Whitaker, and certainly above people like Donald Tusk and people like that. They know, and I am sure that they are right, and they have no reason at all to deceive.
For those who may not be aware, let me just real quick, I want to run to the map right here, because the claim that the Ukrainians are surrounded here, some people look at the map and they go, well, they're not surrounded. There's all this area right here. It's wide open. This gray thatched area right here, or this not thatched, but this gray band that's on the map here, that's not a physical barrier, but what that shows is where the Russians have fire control, because they're in Rodinska up here in the north. And then in the city of Pokrovsk itself, I mean, they continue to take more and more territory. More than half of the city itself is gone. This is Mirgorod, the other area that was mentioned on one of those videos we just showed you. It's the sister city here. Russia is now moving into the southern part of that, and then now even into the northern part. So they're closing in here. This is where a lot of the Ukraine troops are. All in this area they're defending right now. But if Russia has under fire control the only routes coming in or out, then that means it's going to be extremely difficult just to keep them supplied with more ammunition, weapons, food, fuel, etc. And if Russia is able to move in to close this physically off, then they don't even have to fight to take all of these towns and or villages and some of these smaller ones, the buildings, etc. So because there are still some pretty strong defensive positions in here. But if Russia closes these off, they don't need to take this, because then they can literally starve them out and just wait them to come out, and they'll have the whole thing. So that's why this is in a really dangerous situation. And Alexander, when you get into this situation and you look at the situation with these nuclear weapons that have been demonstrated by the Russian side, when you see the economic situation here, not what Ambassador Whitaker is hoping for, but the reality that you talked about here, and then you look at the tactical situation, everything screams that there is nothing to gain for the entire Western world, to include Ukraine, to continue this war any further. Why wait until they collapse here in this pocket? Why wait until the Kiev itself fall? Because they don't have the military forces, if Boyce is correct in this. Why try to find that out when there's no rational path to reverse any of these things and still keep going with the war? What is the logic here?
Well, I don't fully understand the logic myself, because I'm not a military person. I'm not able to explain things tactically in the way that you've just done about Pokrovsk. But to me, it's been perfectly obvious for a long time, basically since very early on in the war, that we were going to arrive at this point eventually. Because I go back to an article that I remember reading that you wrote right at the start of the conflict, which is that will on both sides to keep fighting appears to be equal. In such a situation, it is the side with the greater resources that is going to win in the end, all other things being equal. And the side with the greater resources by far here is the Russians. So yes, we have been able to balance out some of that resource gap up to a certain point ourselves by lending supplies, giving supplies to Ukraine. But we've never been able to do it enough to change that calculus that you discussed 3 years ago, 4 years ago. So this is what people need to understand. Now, I don't really fully understand all of the thinking. I've explained, we've discussed in previous programs that some people in Europe want the war to go on because they're worried that the United States might leave. I think that a military defeat in the Ukraine is much more likely in the end to cause the United States to leave than a negotiated resolution would. Anyway, I still don't understand that thinking, though I happen to know that it exists and it is very prevalent in European capitals.
If you're not an expert in the military stuff, that's fair enough. But you are a lot more knowledgeable than I am, I think, in the political stuff, especially within Europe. So let's just look at Ursula von der Leyen, Mark Rutte, Kaja Kallas, etc., and especially Keir Starmer and Friedrich Merz and Emmanuel Macron. That group right there. They are political animals. They love to live to fight another day politically. They don't want to lose. They don't want to have their support cut, etc. It seems to me, from a political perspective, if you can honestly, behind the scenes, away from the cameras, recognizing the calculus that you just very articulately laid out about if the political will is the same, then all other things being equal, it's the side that has the greater inputs that's going to win. Now it's starting to really play out. So if they are political animals and they don't want to lose, doesn't it seem like that at some point they're going to have to change course, maybe like Bose did there a second ago? Otherwise, they're going to be holding a losing position. And if the expected happens and the military defeat is inflicted, they'll lose politically as well. How does that work out for them?
Well, I think actually you might have put your finger on the problem, because I think these people are now so deeply committed to this. They have spoken so strongly about the necessity to defeat Russia and Ukraine, and they've used that word. I mean, they've actually talked about defeating Russia in Ukraine, that I think they probably fear that if they started to negotiate with the Russians in a way that basically conceded anything that might look like a Russian victory, it would be politically catastrophic for them. Bear in mind that in Europe, we have suffered severely as a result of this war. I mean, we talk about sanctions against Russia, but we see deindustrialization in Germany, economic stagnation in Britain, in France, across Europe. And all of that, as everybody basically knows, is linked to the war and to the economic war that is being fought alongside it. So to come round and tell people in Europe, we did all of this, we spent all that money, we gave all that money to Ukraine, we gave them all our weapons, we engineered deindustrialization in Europe, and actually we have to negotiate and do a deal after all. I think for people like all of the people that you mentioned, that is just more than they can bring themselves to do. So what they're doing instead is hoping that this will go on and that eventually something somewhere will change or turn. Maybe the latest sanctions will somehow do the trick, or maybe Mr. Putin will fall under a bus, or something will happen. You know, live day by day and hope that something will turn up. That's
you know what? That is at least plausible. We interviewed a Ukrainian journalist some months back during the summer, and he was from I believe it was the Kiev Independent, so not the Kiev Post, so which is kind of more pro-government. This one was at least more quasi independent, and they were willing to say some things that were, not popular. And I pressed the guy on it once, and I said, kind of like that, I said, how can you continue to justify going on and supporting the war when all of these inputs are the way they are? And he said something that really I had no comeback to, because he said, basically, we're hoping for a miracle. We just, if we can just keep fighting today, then maybe tomorrow a miracle. I mean, he actually said that. Now, for the country who's fighting, I think it's a terrible way to conduct combat, but at least I can understand it. Yeah. But I can understand it less from the European perspective, hoping for a miracle, because it's just not going to come. And for them to have the same mentality, not under fire, and with their cities not being burned, and continuing to go down this path with the Russians now introducing new, nuclear weapons, that seems to be counterproductive. But I think maybe that's the best explanation. I don't think I can come up with a better one.
Well, I think ultimately, as I said, there's no rational explanation to this. But as I said, we have this expression in England, McCorberism, which is what it is. Live from day to day and hope that something will turn up. Now, the problem is, it is also a profoundly cynical and inhumane approach. Because I mean, Mr. Tusk can talk wonderfully, bravely about Ukraine fighting on for 3 years. What will Ukraine look like in 3 years if that were in fact to happen? I mean, think of the number of people who that kind of language, well, I don't say it condemns them to death, but it sets up the situation which might lead them to being killed. So I think this is a terrible way to think, and it's a terrible way to approach these problems. But it does seem to these political leaders we have in Europe, who I ought to say as a group of people are the least impressive political leaders Europe has produced in my lifetime by far.
Wow.
To them, it looks as if, this is the kind of outlook that they have. They don't want to admit that it's all failed. They don't want to face their own people and explain that it was all went terribly wrong. So they just keep going.
And I can understand their reluctance and their wanting to avoid that outcome. But just in the last few minutes that we have here, what would you project, given your history and your knowledge about European affairs, if the expected happens and the predictable occurs, and there is eventually a collapse of the Ukrainian armed forces and they just lose the war? If these leaders we just mentioned don't want to have that hard conversation by choice now, what is going to happen when the choice is taken out of their hands? What will happen in their political world?
Well, I mean, I think at that point, perhaps we could start looking at a massive political change in Europe. I mean, one of the things to say is that all of these leaders are, without exception now, extremely unpopular in Britain, in Germany, in France, even in Italy, which is less involved in the war anyway. And even in Poland, which is very involved in the war, but which has its own historical grievances, legitimate historical grievances against Russia. The mood is souring, and you can see political forces increasingly growing stronger that are challenging and disagreeing with this whole policy. Now, the trouble with those forces is that some of them don't look particularly convincing or credible as governments. And what they would represent if they ever came to power would be such an enormous break with what has existed up to now in Europe that, I mean, a political revolution might not be too strong a word to describe what might come.
Wow, that's saying quite a bit.
Well, can I just say, at the present moment in time, Reform UK, which is the insurgent party, is polling more than the Labour and Conservative parties, the parties that have dominated British politics for over 100 years. It's polling more than the two of them put together. So that does start to look a bit like a political revolution coming.
It does, and we'll certainly keep a close eye on that one there. So appreciate you bringing that, highlighting it to our viewers here. That's interesting and something we'll be keeping a watch on. And I would wager that there's probably similar dynamics in both France and Germany, but we'll see how it works out there. But listen, I appreciate you coming on today and providing.
October 29th, 2025. And you know the situation is bad for Kiev on the battlefield when the mainstream media in the West start to acknowledge it. This comes, of course, as you have Russia reporting that Russian forces have encircled more than 10,000 Ukrainian soldiers in key points along the front lines. So what does this mean for the overall conflict, and where are things headed as you have Russia also rolling out groundbreaking technology, of which NATO has nothing that compares? Well, we got into all of that and more with a special guest earlier, so let's take a listen to that conversation now. Joining me now to discuss is Scott Ritter, a former UN weapons inspector and U.S. Marine Corps intelligence officer. Scott, thanks so much for taking the time to join me.
Thank you very much for having me.
It's great to have you on the show. Now, I want to get your take on the latest here. I know it's being reported that Russia is closing in on Pokrovsk, with officials reporting that Russian forces have around 5,500 Ukrainian soldiers encircled. Now, even mainstream media outlets here in the West are starting to admit that the situation is bad for Kiev and that Pokrovsk is a key supply and transport hub that will disrupt supply lines, yes, but also give Russia access to Kiev's last remaining strongholds in the region. So how do you view the current situation surrounding Pokrovsk and what it means for the war overall?
Well, I mean, it's reflective of the trend. The trend is that Russia retains strategic initiative throughout the entire line of contact, and that Russia has focused its resources on particular points that will degrade Ukraine's defensive posture and put Russia in a more favorable position to continue the offensive. Russia is not looking for a ceasefire. Any ceasefire that occurs must occur in concert with Ukraine acknowledging the legitimacy and the inevitability of Russia's stated goals and objectives, especially when it comes to territory. So the Ukrainians can either give up territory and save lives, or lose territory and lose lives. And what we're seeing in Pokrovsk is that If Ukraine wants to fight, Russia will give them the fight. And right now in Pokrovsk, I believe up in Kupiansk, further north, Kupiansk, there's 5,000 Ukrainian soldiers in danger of being encircled or encircled. And in Pokrovsk, it's 5,500. Whether this is a classic, encirclement where the Russians have, troops 360 degrees around, or is this an encirclement where Russia has taken key terrain features and controls, any potential exits with, overwatch and fire, meaning that if the Ukrainians attempt to break out, they'll be killed, and it's a de facto encirclement? We don't know. There's reports that suggest it's not a complete encirclement. Even the Russians acknowledge that, they may not have full 360-degree control, but that their ability to bring fire down, observed fire down on Ukrainians in short notice, gives them the equivalency of encirclement. But this is a bad thing for the Ukrainians. It's not just Pokrovsk and Kupiansk, though. If you go up and down the battlefield, people, I always love it when, the armchair warriors that are out there, the Russians aren't advancing. They're advancing little pieces here, there, and everywhere. I'm like, yeah, it's still an advance, but it is a war of attrition. And Russia has goals and objectives that are geared around terminating Ukrainian life, the military life. That's how you win a war of attrition. And what Russia's done, if you look at Pokrovsk, basically the Ukrainians dig in and the Russians compel them by making a move on a position of importance. The Ukrainians dig in, reinforce, make it very difficult to take with a direct assault. And then the Russians begin to envelop, come in from the left and the right, and they create these pincers that come around. And next thing you know, the Ukrainians are in danger of being encircled. We've seen this over and over again, where the Ukrainians then have to retreat. What's happened here is that the Russians have closed off the retreat. So the Russians are making a decision now that they're going to finish the job. These 5,500 Ukrainians aren't going back into the fight. And up and down the front, you'll see little mini encirclements taking place all over the place. We're talking about, it's about 10,500 between Kupiansk and Pokrovsk, but overall, the number of Ukrainian troops that are in danger of encirclement is around 50,000 troops. Now, most of these will probably withdraw, but as they withdraw, understand they will be subjected to fire, and you can assess that 20 to 30% of these will become casualties, either dead or wounded, taken out of the fight. So, you were talking, 20 to 20,000 Ukrainians are going to be eliminated. There's nobody to replace them. And so there's be huge gaps. If Pokrovsk and Kupiansk fall, we're talking about 31 battalions of Ukrainian troops taken out of the order of battle. These are experienced battalions that have been fighting for some time, good command and control, et cetera. They're gone. What are they going to be replaced with? There's no experienced battalions to replace them. So they'll be bringing in, units that have, low morale, poor training, poor unit cohesion. That'll be making mistakes. They'll suffer high casualties. They'll get surrounded. This is the beginning of the end. And everybody said, well, you've been saying that for some time. Well, sometimes it takes a long time to develop. I mean, there's a couple realities that come up. First of all, I was trained to fight war in a very aggressive way, and we had the resources to do this. The Russians have opted to fight a different kind of war, one that doesn't produce Iwo Jima memorials every 5 days, to honor 5,000 to 7,000 dead Marines. They are suffering casualties, but this is high intensity conflict up and down. The Russians have scaled this war in a way that they can absorb their casualties while inflicting maximum casualties on the Ukrainians. To change that algorithm to make it more about capturing territory than killing Ukrainians could be done, but then the Russians would lose more equipment and more manpower. The manpower, I don't think other than the moral factor, Russia can absorb the cash. The equipment, Russia's at war not with Ukraine, but the collective West. And the collective West is providing Ukraine with artillery, armor, everything. So Russia needs to ensure that its rate of loss in terms of the equipment is manageable, that they still are able to outproduce the collective West. And we know they are 4-1, 4 times as much production coming out of Russia. So why would you change your algorithm, your tactics to lower that, to make it 1-1 or so that you're losing more equipment than the Ukrainians are? No, the Russians are playing this very smart. It's a game of patience on their part. Sometimes it's frustrating for observers. I can't say it's frustrating for me because I don't have any skin in the game. Would I like this war to be over? Absolutely. Do I think Russia's on the right side of history? Absolutely. But it's not like I've gone to Las Vegas and put $25,000 on Russia taking Pokrovsk by November 7th. So I don't, what Russia does is what Russia does. It's Russia's business. And what Ukraine does is its business. Same thing with NATO. My job is to sit back and try to assess it as objectively as possible. And what I'm seeing right now is that the Russian strategy, which has been criticized in many places, is a sign of weakness. You've seen people like, Gilbert Doctorow and John, I think Roberts is his last name, who are saying that Putin's patience is a sign of weakness. Well, ask the Ukrainians in Pokrovsk how weak they think Vladimir Putin is. Ask the Ukrainians in Kupiansk how weak they think Vladimir Putin is. We also have to be careful that we're being inundated with a flood of anti-Russian propaganda. There is a massive information warfare campaign taking place, more than likely run by the British. It has all the classic earmarks of a British operation, which is sophisticated. And it basically is flooding the market with specific themes that are repeated over and over and over again. And, it's the old adage, if you say something often enough, it sort of gets assumed to be the truth. And so there's a lot of people being confused or, being misdirected by what they're reading on social media platforms or what they're reading in the Telegraph just came out that Vladimir Putin's in a panic. There's going to be a coup, apparently. I mean, my God, there's going to be a coup. And Vladimir Putin is in an absolute panic. Nobody in Russia believes any of this, but apparently the Russian reality doesn't matter. But it matters in Pokrovsk, it matters in Kupiansk, and it matters in the dozen little battles that are taking place where Russia's winning. That's the only reality that matters. You can fool yourself on social media all you want, but at the end of the day, it's just words. It's what's happening on the ground that counts. And my take is that Russia is in the driver's seat. They have the strategic advantage. They will continue to hold the strategic advantage for some time to come, if not forever.
Yeah, and you see as the media tries so hard, I mean, even just with the latest updates that Russian officials have announced, you've got the reports that come in and they go, oh, well, Zelensky said that's not true. Or, oh, well, anonymous Ukrainian officials said that only 200 Russian troops got into Pokrovsk. And it's like they always have something to say to kind of try to combat the reports that are coming from Russia. And as all of that is happening, you also have, I know President Trump has a comment on everything. He's saying that Russia needs to focus on ending the war in Ukraine. I would say that they are, as you were noting, in their own way. But Russia's also focused on creating new technology. And you've got Russian officials announcing the successful test launch of a new unlimited range nuclear powered missile that can evade air defenses, the Burevestnik. Now, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said that it's about looking out for Russia's security interest, noting that, quote, ensuring security is a vital issue for Russia, especially against the backdrop of the militaristic sentiment that we are currently hearing primarily from the Europeans. So how do you view the announcement of Russia's new missile and the impact that it could have on the overall world of war, especially as the New START treaty is very close to expiring?
Well, let's just start off by saying that if the Burevestnik is ever used, it doesn't matter. We'll all be dead. It's a nuclear weapon, 1 megaton warhead. The good news is it's not a first strike weapon. It's a weapon of retaliation. And that's why it was developed. People need to go back. Nothing happens in a vacuum, especially in Russia. Everything is linked to something in the past. In 2002, George W. Bush withdrew from the anti-ballistic missile treaty. This was one of the foundational arms control agreements reached between the United States and the Soviet Union, signed in 1972 after years of negotiations. And it was the culmination of a joint realization, a mutual realization that if there was a nuclear war, nobody was going to win and everybody was going to die. And therefore, a nuclear war should never be fought. And therefore, it's sort of futile to try and build defenses. Because what was happening is, as ballistic missile technologies improved, both Russia and the United States were seeking to build missile interceptors that could shoot down incoming missiles. And as a result, we get advances in technology. We get the Minuteman missile, which is a solid rocket missile. We get the Russians starting to put multiple warheads on missiles. So you have one interceptor coming after a missile, but if I have if I flood the zone with missiles, each one of which has 10 warheads on it, you can't shoot them all down. The warheads are going to flood you. And both sides realize this is getting out of control. This is becoming very dangerous. So we're going to embrace the notion of mutually assured destruction. If we go to nuclear war, we all die. So let's not go to nuclear war. And in order to ensure that we aren't tempted into it, we're not going to defend ourselves. We're going to agree there's no defense. But then after 9/11, first of all, that worked in the 70s, but then when Ronald Reagan came in the 80s, strategic defense initiatives, Star Wars, we thought we were going to build a missile defense shield. And we never could. The technology wasn't there. It was overhyped, oversold. But it always was a dream of the sort of anti-Russian, anti-communist, conservative element of America, the dream of a missile defense. And after 9/11, they were able to turn the threat of so-called rogue states, Iran, North Korea, etc., into justification for us to pull out of the anti-ballistic missile treaty, telling the Russians, you don't have anything to worry about, except that one of the first things we do is we develop a ground-based interceptor, base it in Greeley, Alaska, to shoot down, we say North Korean missiles, but it shoots down Russian missiles as well. And the Russians are like, we're not too happy with that. And then we deploy the Mark 41 Aegis ashore in the anti-ballistic missile configuration in Poland and Romania. And the Russians are like, we're not too happy with that. And then we build the Aegis ships to turn them into missile shooters. And we have a global network. And the Russians are going, we're not too happy with any of this because all you've done is create, at least theoretically, a missile shield when coupled with your ability to bring Trident D5 missiles on Ohio-class submarines close to Russian shores, fire them on a flat trajectory. You can knock out our command and control, knock out much of our force, and any retaliation we have left gets shot down by your missiles, and our strategic nuclear deterrence posture has been eradicated. The Russians warned over and over again, don't do this. Don't do this. This is not smart. In 2010, they signed the New START Treaty, the last remaining arms control vehicle. It expires in February 5th of next year. It's not going to be, the treaty's over. They're going to keep the caps in place for another year voluntarily. The caps are important because in the Cold War, each side had around 20, 30,000 nuclear warheads. Now under the caps, it's 1,550. We'd like it to go lower, at least I would. But if this treaty expires and there are no limits, we're going to see it go up and begin the process that won't stop until we're back to 20, 30, 40,000 deployed strategic nuclear warheads each side, right back where we started, the insanity. And so you've got this treaty vehicle. The Russians negotiated it, but a key aspect of their 2010 negotiating position was to link the treaty with ballistic missile defense. You might remember there was a famous or infamous clip, depending on whose perspective, of Barack Obama and Dmitry Medvedev, who's at that time the president. I think they were in South Korea. And it was a hot mic moment where Medvedev asked about ballistic missile defense, and Barack turned back and said, you got to give me some time till the next election. After the election, I have a lot more flexibility to work with you. And Medvedev said, well, I'll let Putin know. But even before that, the negotiating position of the Russians was always, we have to bring up missile defense. Anatoly Antonov was the lead negotiator for the Russians. Rose Guttmiller was the lead negotiator for the Americans. And Anatoly Antonov said, we need missile defense. Rose came back and said, look, here's the American position. We understand your position on missile defense, but we can't get this treaty through the Senate. We can't get through ratification if there's a rider on it about missile defense. Keep it separate. Let us finish this treaty. And then I promise you, we'll get back to missile defense, one of our first agenda items. And Anatoly Antonov went, all right, we trust you. Big mistake, because we got New Start in, and Julianne picks up the phone to Rose and says, hey, when are we starting on missile defense? And she went, no, it's no longer our priority. And that's what prompted Medvedev to turn to Obama saying, what are you doing to me? And Obama said, just give me time. I got these midterm elections. Obama lied. We had no intention of doing ballistic missile defense. 2018, Vladimir Putin does a presentation. You might have seen it live on TV, where he says, we've been telling you, don't do this. Don't do missile defense. Don't move in this direction. But you never listen to us. So let me introduce you to my new friends, sort of like a scene out of Scarface. Let me introduce you to my little friend, Sarmat, giant ICBM, multiple warheads, but it's not coming at you through the traditional northern polar route. It's coming from the south because it's very long range where you don't have any early warning detection missile defense. It's going to come in and it's going to blow you up and you'll never even know it hit you. Welcome to the world of Sarmat. Poseidon. The Russian new big submarines can launch the Poseidon nuclear torpedo, which can go off and just hang out outside the East Coast or West Coast of the United States near a big city. And when the time's right, let's say we attacked Russia, it comes up, blows up, and it takes out the entire East Coast with a massive tidal wave. Boom. Avant-garde, maneuvering warhead, hypersonic, comes in, you can't shoot it down, hits everything, kills everything. And last but not least was the Beresvesnik, which is a nuclear-powered cruise missile with unlimited range. Basically, they can hide it throughout Russia, and if Russia gets attacked, your Beresvesnik can take off, and it can come at you any way it wants to. You'll never see it. It's going to kill you. And the Russians may program it to wait a month, 2 months, 3 months. Doesn't matter. It's coming in. It can fly forever. You're not going to shoot it down. Boom. Now, the Beresvesnik had some growing pains. These were theoretical weapons. The Sarmat got deployed first in Avant-Garde. Poseidon's out there now. But Beresvesnik had a hiccup. If you remember a couple years ago, maybe 2020, or maybe even a little bit after that, there was an accident up north near Arkhangelsk. They were pulling a Beresvesnik out of the water, and it blew up, and it killed five scientists, I think 3 of whom were from Rosatom. And a lot of speculation about how it wasn't going to work, couldn't work. There was a setback, et cetera, et cetera. Putin just said it worked. They flew it. I think it was 14 hours in the air, 15,000 kilometers, and it's a clean burning engine. It doesn't leave. The Americans kept saying, well, you can't do it because when we tried it, our engine spewed radioactive crap and we decided that it was can't do it. And the Russians were like, well, we did it. It's not spewing any radioactive crap. It sort of does its job. It's there. Now, the Russians have said that the missile has passed its test. Now they have to decide how they're going to classify it, how it's going to fit into their nuclear doctrine. And then they have to build units, and they have to go into serial production. They have to deploy it. But it's there. So any future arms control treaty now is going to have to bring into account this weapon. And if you want to have the Russians put this under control, what are we getting in return? If that's the Russian perspective. You guys want avant-garde? You don't have the equivalent of that. You want, Poseidon? How do we classify that? You want this? Guys, you're going to have to do something for us. Things you never wanted to do before, like, those B-61 bombs in Europe that are just hanging out there as a NATO, you got to get rid of them. Oh, the French and the British, they don't get to have independent nuclear forces either, not that are linked to NATO. And so the Russians are, for the first time, taking control of the arms control negotiation process. They're setting the kind of terms that we used to set, because there was a time when the Russians had all these systems and we had nothing. And we said we need to capture them all in the interests of arms control, but we linked it to bettering economic relations and things of that nature. And the Russians played ball, especially in the end with Gorbachev. And as you know, today in the as people retrospectively look at history, Gorbachev's come under a lot of criticism for giving away too much, not asking enough. And I think the Russians are saying, we're never going to make that mistake again. We're never going to go to the table and give away the farm. The Russians also recognize that if it weren't for their strategic nuclear deterrence, the war in Ukraine would be a completely different war with major NATO involvement, et cetera. The only thing that keeps NATO out is Russia saying this conflict is of existential importance to us. We're not going to lose it because nations that are armed with strategic nuclear weapons, they don't lose wars.
Yeah, very, very telling there that, and even as you were laying it out, right? All of the little places where the US and NATO as a whole, they have lied to Russia. They have used the Minsk agreements. They have used even something as simple as a conversation between Obama and Medvedev. And Russia looks at the US and they're like, oh, wait, we really can't trust you. And you're going to use every opportunity to take advantage of us. And I thought it was interesting. You've got NBC News releasing this report citing anonymous officials quoting a new U.S. intelligence assessment, which says that Russian President Putin is, quote, more dug in than ever when it comes to the war in Ukraine and has no interest in compromising to make a deal with Trump. Now, going back to the fact that it's been made clear to Russia that they can't trust NATO and the US in particular, how do you view Russia's current position when it comes to them being in the driver's seat and really just how far they want to go in these tensions with NATO?
Russia has been, again, we come back to the criticism that's put out there by Gilbert Doctorow and John Paul Roberts and others that Putin is weak, by playing this game along, by not wanting to escalate. While that may be the pragmatic right choice to avoid conflict, it shows Russia is weak, and the West takes advantage of this sign of weakness by not treating the Russian position with respect, etc. I don't buy into that notion because I actually believe that the Russians are better prepared for topics, and when they make a policy decision, it's not done in a knee-jerk reaction, kumbaya. Vladimir Putin saying, let's hold hands, sing kumbaya, and hope for the best, guys. We're going to come in with goodwill, and we just hope the West shares our will. Amen, brother. No, I think Vladimir Putin lays out all the options and says, well, we don't want a war. We don't want escalation. We are winning. So why don't we continue to win, and yet we'll go forward and say we're ready for negotiations. If they're serious about negotiations, then they'll come back and say, they'll accept our terms and we'll work with it then. But what he found is that the West isn't ever going to accept Russia's terms. That what the West wants is a completely frozen conflict, North-South Korea. They don't care about Ukraine. It's about maintaining some sense of war that tears down the Russian economy, causes the Russia social contract with their government to fray, and even eventually, hopefully, from the Western perspective, bring down Vladimir Putin's government. This is what they want. I think there was people in the Putin government that believed that Donald Trump was different, that he could actually push through NATO, through Congress, everything, a peace plan that would be acceptable to the Russians. And they were willing to give that a try. I think the Russians have come awake, and they now know that the Trump government is incapable of compromise, that they don't want peace, they want victory. What he calls peace is an American victory. They want to permanently weaken Russia. This is the goal. This is the objective. And I think for the first time, the Russians have come in and said, we're done. I mean, I saw something come out of, somewhere in the foreign ministry. I don't know if it was from Lavrov or someone else, but, in the past, it was the United States saying, we hope that Vladimir Putin, when he comes to the table, brings a plan capable of, bringing in, we're waiting for the Russians to commit to this. And the Russians came back and said, yeah, there's really no reason for us to meet with Donald Trump unless the Americans are willing to come in with a realistic plan. And until that time, we're not going to meet. It's not in our interest to meet. They've turned they flipped the script. They're in the driver's seat. And you know why they're in the driver's seat? Because of Prokhorovsk, Kupiansk, and these other realities. The other thing that's not talked about, if you look at the social media, you'll see Russian oil refineries blowing up here, there, and everywhere. And of course, you combine that with the sanction of Lukoil and Rosneft. Suddenly now the sky is falling. The Russian oil economy is collapsing. It's over. Putin's going to have to surrender it. Boom, 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 boom. No, actually, Russians will hit their belt a couple notches, tighten it up, but they've got a plan. They're working this through. There is no collapse of the Indian market. There is no collapse of the Chinese market. There is no collapse of the southern global market. Russia will sell oil where, the number of barrels may drop off, but thanks to the sanctions, the price of oil is going up. So it's going to be like a wash for the Russians. But But so there's this hope that you're going to bring down but the real damage is what Russia's doing to Ukraine on a daily basis. I mean, the Ukrainians are going to be rolling into winter with no electricity anywhere. I mean, there's this Ukrainian parliamentarian who I view as a war criminal, and I believe one day he not only should be arrested, but will be arrested and held accountable. He was in Odessa in May with the group that murdered the 48 Russians. He went around and kicked the bodies of the Russians that jumped out of the burning building to make sure they were dead and mocked them. True Ukrainian nationalist, what. But, he is now saying, Zelensky promised to, turn the lights out in Moscow. Behind me in Kiev is the Hotel Moscow, and the lights are out. Meaning that's the reality of it. All throughout Ukraine, it's over. The Russians have a strategic air campaign that's hitting the energy, and the West is ignoring this aspect of the story, instead focusing on the propaganda aspect of how they're breaking Russia's will to resist, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Are they doing harm to Russia? Yeah. Does it cause pain? Yep. Can Russia adjust? Yeah, they are. And will Russia win? Yes. Ukraine, on the other hand, is being wiped off the map in terms of its ability to sustain itself as a civilized state. And I think we're going to be just seeing a different winter and a different vibe coming out of Ukraine. I think the will to resist is going to be diminished greatly rolling into next year.
Yeah, it's very telling as you're watching all of this play out. And exactly as you're noting there, Russia is adapting, yet NATO doesn't seem to be, right? NATO seems to be going on with the exact same plan with no actual real backup plan, just thinking, oh, Kiev will hold on. Well, that's all fine and good until they're not able to hold on anymore.
There's 2,000 French troops getting ready to deploy. That ignores the fact that every day Ukraine loses 2,300, 3,000 troops. So the French are willing to provide enough troops to survive less than a day in combat against the Russians. I mean, that's NATO in a nutshell.
And to add to that, one other comment that I saw from Germany's defense minister declaring that this winter will be crucial for Kiev. And I'm like, okay, I see the headline. What's under that? Oh, well, the EU needs to get on it with using frozen Russian assets to support Ukraine. That's their answer. Like, there's no, oh, we're going to, we have this concrete plan to ramp up production here, or, oh, we have the troops right beyond just 2,500 to actually change the balance of power on the battlefield. The last thing I'll throw in there, when it comes to NATO, how do you see how long they're willing to stay in this at this pace?
Well, I mean, NATO is, of course, an alliance of, what are they, up to 30 some odd members now? It's not a question of how long is the organization willing to stay, and it's how long are the individual members of this organization able to sustain this. Right now, you have these NATO countries are almost exclusively, I mean, there are some exceptions, governed by political and economic elites that have bought into this notion of, a viable European Union capable of standing on its own 2 feet, and the imperative of this transatlantic alliance that backs this European Union strength up to the hilt. In order to sustain all that in a post-Cold War environment, you have to have an enemy, and that enemy is Russia. And so they've postured Russia to be the enemy. They've created conflict in Ukraine to push that along. They never expected Russia to be able to do what it's doing. They honestly thought that Russia would fold like a house of cards after the sanctioning that took place in 2022. They never expected that Russia would be able to sustain this fight economically or militarily, and therefore this would bring about the political collapse of Vladimir Putin, which this is all about. You go to Vegas, you'll see some guys come in. They have a strategy. They go to a table and they've got a limit. And if they're gambling and they reach their limit, they walk. They cut their losses. They say, well, that's it. I've got to regroup and reapproach this. Then you see the idiots that come in and they just keep going in. Then they go empty out their credit cards and they go do the mortgage. And next thing you know, they've lost they're in. And they have no choice. They're at the table. They're committed to the game. They've mortgaged their children's future, their wives' future, their family's future. And it's all riding on this last roll of the dice and they're just there. That's NATO. They've mortgaged everything to commit to this course of action, and they're playing against the house, and the odds are stacked against it. The Russians aren't playing. The Russians are playing with dice that are loaded in favor of the house. Russians are playing with cards marked that only the house can read. There's a roulette table where they're pumping the ball, and it goes where they want it to go. The bottom line is NATO can't win. That's the reality. And one by one, you're going to start to see these NATO countries fold and go away. Macron is hanging on by a hair. I don't think they're going to get this budget passed that he wants to be passed. He's already made compromises on pensions, but it's a temporary compromise. They're delaying it for a year, but Macron's never going to renege on that. The bottom line is Macron is unsustainable as the president of France. And when he goes, the likelihood is he can be replaced by a far right-wing party of Marine Le Pen, Marine Le Pen is going to say, we're not in favor of this war. Keir Starmer is going to get the thumb. And when he does, the new British government will probably say, we can't afford this war. We got to focus on the thing. Germany, Merz, they just stood up a brigade in Lithuania. Think about that for a moment. The Germans stood up a brigade in Lithuania, and nobody's going, what? The 45th Brigade. I mean, these guys are awesome. They're Germans. They can't fight. They don't have any equipment, but they're there with a evening tattoo, with garbage cans that have been carved in precise German fashion to show the unit symbol as they line up with their berets, and they look so violent and all this. It's a joke, but even the German government that's promoting this joke, they're not going to survive. They can't afford pensions. Basically, these political and economic elites are asking the European people to give up everything so that they can continue this fight in Ukraine that makes no sense for them. And so what I think we're going to see is that NATO is just going to become a vehicle that's unsustainable, and one by one, nations are going to start to opt out. And when that happens, it'll become a cascade, and that'll be the end of NATO.
Yeah, it's very telling. This is the fight that they chose, and yet Russia on its end said, okay, you guys wanted this fight, and they have responded to it at every turn. There's certainly a lot at stake here all around, and I really appreciate you taking the time.
Donald Trump is on something of a rampage through Asia, through Southeast Asia, where the locals have got him sussed. If you offer him something cheap, nasty, garish, vulgar, and that looks like gold, he is yours for life. In fact, when he was offered in South Korea today a crown, he said he'd like to wear it home. Take it out the wrapper. I don't want it wrapped. I don't need a gift box. Give me it now. I'll wear it on my head. And he wasn't joking. Supposedly, the Americans are involved in a no kings movement. Well, Donald Trump is definitely keen to be their king, and you wouldn't rule it out. But he does meet real life when he meets the Chinese President Xi Jinping in a day or so, when they begin to deal with the trade talks, with the tariff wars that have devastated the stock markets and devastated the supply lines of international business these last few months. Well, there's no doubt who won the tariff war. The West won the Opium War. The West definitely practiced a century of humiliation on China, but it's Donald Trump that faces humiliation in these talks. He is ready to drop entirely all the tariffs that he's imposed on China. Now, I lost count, you probably did too. How many and how much were the tariffs on the bewildering array of essential items that China sells to the United States of America. But you don't need to remember them now because they are all about to go. A harsh lesson has been learned, and not just by the United States. China's superpower status is not just in its armed forces. It's not just in its 1.45 billion population. It's not just in its soft power. It is in its hard economic power, a hard economic power that is now insurmountable. It seems the West have decided that China's power is here to stay, that it cannot be contained, that it cannot be rolled back. At least that's my take. Others have a different one. But it seems to me the meaning of the fantastic softening of Trump's rhetoric for the last few months, he's been virtually threatening war short of tomahawks, economic war for sure. He's been threatening it on China, and now he is not. And he's about to make a trade deal with China, which definitely establishes the truth of what China has just announced this very day, that China is no longer a developing country. If you've been to China, as we have in the last couple of weeks, the idea that China could be described as a developing country was always fantastic and absurd, but it's now official. Xi Jinping said China can no longer be described as a developing country. Sure, there's inequality between one man, one woman, and another. Sure, there's still dramatic inequality between one province and another. But the equalization of wealth is rapidly transforming China. Well, we're still in Minsk, and that's the capital of Belarus. As it happens, we're going by train to Moscow. But the other international guests at the Forum on Security are not so lucky. They don't have a visa necessarily to enter Russia from Belarus, and we're hoping to get back home, either to European countries or North America, or even farther afield, but they now cannot, because NATO has told the yapping chihuahuas in Latvia and Lithuania to close their borders on the absurd pretext, the old China pretext, actually, that unauthorized balloons have been spotted in the sky. And until we know who sent them and for what, well, there'll be no traffic. So most people came by train or car through Latvia or through Lithuania, but they will not be leaving that way. European Union customers are supposed to be exempt, but they have not turned out yet to be. My point is that the onslaught against Belarus, totally unjustified, which has done nothing to anybody, hasn't fired a shot at anybody, is still continuing. And of course, the reason is because Belarus stands with Russia. But then most of the world stands with Russia, and we're going to make ourselves a lot of enemies in Western countries if we keep this pretense up much longer that you can sanction Russia to surrender. This very evening, there is a twin military collapse going on in the Ukrainian armed forces. And that place I've told you about so often that you're probably calling your sons Kupiansk is about to fall finally to the Russian armed forces. But it's not the only one. Right across the line, right across the front line, the Russian armed forces are carrying all before them, and the number of Ukrainian forces surrendering with a promise of a safe conduct from Russia is now rapidly increasing. Thousands are expected in the next couple of days because 10,500 Ukrainian soldiers are now trapped in a kessel, the kind that von Paulus was trapped in Stalingrad in 1944. That has now been the fate of a big Ukrainian army. 10,500 men are now in negotiation to surrender. And the territory thus captured is strategically vital to the Ukrainian war effort. And it's distinctly possible. We'll talk to Scott Ritter, the real expert, about this later in the show. But it's distinctly possible that before there can be a meeting in Budapest, this war might be over. The Ukrainians have decided they don't want to die for Zelensky. They don't want to die for the corrupt oligarchy that sustains him in power. And they're voting with their feet. Either their men surrendering at the front or their men and women fleeing the country. 9 million Ukrainians have fled the country. And some of them are quite patriotic still. Some of them still support the war effort, but not to the extent of actually joining it. They are the same kind of draft dodgers that Donald Trump once was. Donald Trump dodged 4 drafts, and that's why he's never seen war up close and personal. That's why it's all some kind of joke to him. He had bone spurs, the poor lamb. It didn't stop him having a lifetime of swinging golf clubs across even his own golf courses. And it didn't stop him dancing, including today, to YMCA. I don't know if anyone's told Donald yet. It's an international gay anthem, but he does love dancing to it. And his bone spurs miraculously seem to have cured themselves. I mention that because Donald Trump's about to enter yet another war. It's an extraordinary thing that the man who calls himself the peace president, the man who really thinks he's got a chance of the Nobel Peace Prize, is about to start gratuitously, for no reason whatsoever, another war. Don't tell me it's about fentanyl, as Senator Rand Paul pointed out the other day. Venezuela supplies none of the fentanyl which enters the United States. Not, he said, not much of it, none of it. It all comes through Mexico. It has nothing to do with Venezuela. And if you're believing the casus belli, that Trump is going to invade, attack, bomb Venezuela because of drug cartels, you are such an idiot. You should not be watching the mother of all talk shows. And I advise you to switch off right now. If you believe that this has anything to do with drugs, you are an idiot. There's no drugs coming to the United States from Venezuela, least of all in boats, that would require 40 refuelings if they were to reach Miami. I mean, as ferrying illegal drugs go, sending a boat, a speedboat from Venezuela to the coast of Miami would just be the most ridiculous way you could possibly imagine. No, these extrajudicial killings, well, let's call them what they are, these acts of murder on the high seas that the Americans are boasting about, that the White House is posting as official White House films, and that the American military are being ordered to carry out, these are pure and simple acts of mass murder. And many of the people murdered so far haven't even been Venezuelans. Never mind not Venezuelan drug traffickers. They were Colombian citizens, fishermen. They were from Trinidad and Tobago, which inexplicably is participating in the war drive that Donald Trump is currently garnering. Ironically, in Trinidad and Tobago, there's a full battle group. There's aircraft carriers, battleships, and the whole area is now bristling with fighter jets and with the B-1 bombers that presumably will be dropping their ordnance on downtown Caracas sometime soon. There's no doubt that the US can shell from the sea the people of Venezuela. There's no doubt that they can fire missiles at them. There's no doubt that they can bomb them from on high, but they can't occupy Venezuela. I'm here to tell you that. First of all, the US doesn't have enough soldiers to invade Venezuela, which is a truly gigantic country, which is, as my good friend Garland Nixon put it, either jungle or mountain or mountains with jungle. It is the ideal place for a guerra prolongada. That's what you're in for, Donald. A guerra prolongada, prolonged war. And any American occupation forces stationed in Venezuela will be going home in boxes in very large numbers. So if you are the mother or father of an American serviceman, I advise you to do everything that you can to dissuade Donald Trump from this course. And that's even before we calibrate the fact that Russia has just signed a strategic partnership, including a military partnership with Venezuela, as has China, as has Iran. So if you really want World War III to be waged in the barrios, in the mountains, in the jungles of Venezuela, well, be my guest. One part of me hopes that you do, because the United States is behaving like a man-child, like a delinquent child. Trump said today, any country we make war on, we will destroy it. He is behaving like a caricature, like a Bugsy Malone kid's caricature of the Mafia 5 families. He is disgracing the great people of the United States with the threats, vulgar, base threats that he is now daily, even hourly, engaged upon. I need to move on because there are many, many issues that we're going to touch on tonight. If, like me, you've seen some of the horrors that happened over the last day or two after a prolonged siege of more than 400 days, the rebel forces, the RSF, backed by certain Arabian Gulf countries, they finally broke the siege. They finally entered the territory they'd been besieging, and they proceeded to cold-bloodedly massacre the people inside. Mothers with their babies, old men, young women being raped, and none of this is hostile propaganda claims. All of this was filmed by the Sudanese rebels that we used to call the Janjaweed themselves. They took the videos of themselves cold-bloodedly massacring people for no reason, people on their knees begging for mercy, ruthlessly and brutally murdered on the cameras of their murderers, and then put on social media by their murderers. Whoever is arming these people, whoever is backing these people, whoever in any way is enabling these people, should this evening hang their heads in black burning shame. If I or anybody associated with me had supported what we've seen today on social media and the boasts of mass rapes taking place, I would never be able to show my face in public again. And I hope that those who have facilitated this will now bring it dramatically and immediately to an end. This nihilistic, anarchistic, this brutal, sadistic, demonic violence is enough almost to make you lose your faith in human nature. And when you hear the name of God being chanted as the crime is being committed by the criminal that's committing it and videoing it so he can put it out later, you begin to lose all kinds of faith, I must say. I never had any faith that Israel was going to observe a ceasefire in Gaza, and my lack of faith was definitely not misplaced. 98 Palestinians were murdered yesterday. 74 of them were women and children. It was a frenzy of murderous violence endorsed by the Vice President and the President of the United States, endorsed by the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. And Israel has just said the ceasefire is back in place. We had our frenzy. We murdered our 100 Palestinian women and children mainly. But now the ceasefire's on again, and the Americans are taking credit for it. We've got so much to discuss tonight, and we've got two of our biggest and best guests. First, Professor Syed Mohammed Marandi from Tehran. He's up first to talk about the events in the Middle East region. And then, later in the show, the one and only Scott Ritter to talk about the dramatic events taking place right now in the Donbass in Ukraine. Stay tuned. It's the Mother. Professor Marandi doesn't need any introduction. For all this time, his sage wisdom has talked us through many a crisis, talked us through many atrocities. But it's my great regret that I have to talk to him this evening on the atrocities taking place by Muslims on Muslims in a Muslim country, namely Sudan. Professor Mohammed Marandi, welcome, as always, to the mother of all talk shows. I've seldom been as horrified as I was today. Perhaps I oughtn't to have watched them, but I watched so many videos today of such crimes as are almost unspeakable. And the more unspeakable because the name of God was being chanted by the murderers as they slayed innocent and defenseless people. Most people watching this will not know much about the conflict in Sudan, who's who and what's what, and I'm hoping your expertise can enlighten them. What is happening in Sudan, Professor?
Well, Sudan was the largest country in Africa, George, and you know Africa better than I, and you know Sudan better than I. But the West didn't want the Sudan to be a strong and powerful force, and they began destroying the country with the separatist movement in South Sudan. And now South Sudan, which is separate, is just as poor and impoverished and full of infighting and death and destruction as is the rest of the country. Of course, the last few days, the last couple of days have been extraordinary. And I think really the root cause here is the United Arab Emirates. The United Arab Emirates has been funding the RSF, and they've been funding groups across the board. And this is a problem that exists both with the United Arab Emirates and Qatar and some of these other oil-rich Arab dictatorships in the Persian Gulf, which have been funding groups everywhere. They're, of course, both in the U.S. camp, both Qatar and the Emirates, and they've been funding differing groups in different parts of the world. But in this case, the Emirates has been pushing very hard, and this group has been utterly brutal and barbaric and murderous. And I saw one or two clips, and I just couldn't finish watching. But this is not over. It's going to the RSF is consolidating its strength, and I think that they're moving towards dividing Sudan yet again into two parts. But we'll have to see what lies ahead. But it's extraordinary how ruthless and murderous people can be, just taking ordinary people and slaughtering them. What we've seen for the last 2 years in Gaza has made everyone, I think, sick enough, and now watching the scenes in Sudan just make it much more saddening. I don't want to say depressing, because none of us should become depressed. We have to remain active and remain steadfast in our activism against empire and against the brutality of these dictatorships and ruthless regimes in the region, especially these wealthy oil and gas regimes, which are bound to the empire.
They've got such a cuddly reputation in the West. The United Arab Emirates, which once are revered in the time of the late Sheikh Zayed, he built something special in the United Arab Emirates, and they've got such a cuddly image in the West. People go there on holidays, they invest in apartments there, they have sports competitions galore there. They're the best friends of Donald Trump, the best friends of the British, and so on. And yet they are arming and funding slaughterers that make ISIS look like Boy Scouts. I've never seen anything like, even in the ISIS, the height of ISIS, what I watched today. How would they justify that, Professor? How do they say to their own people, to their allies, yeah, sure, we're behind that. What are you going to do?
Well, these are absolute monarchies in the Emirates and Qatar. You cannot say anything there. The people in these countries have no rights. Overwhelmingly, the people in these countries are, as I'm sure you know, indentured servants, if not slaves. And those people have absolutely nothing. They have absolutely no opportunity to say anything. Then you have the better off indentured servants and slaves that are from the West. And then you have the citizens. But the citizens, they have no right to protest or speak out against these policies. And what's happening today is not really new. The genocide in Yemen that the Saudis and the Emiratis carried out for years was something that led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people in that country, and they were using mercenaries from Sudan against the people of Yemen back then to carry out genocide too. So this is not new for the current ruler in the Emirates. And the Emirates is also well known for other forms of corruption, both prostitution, but more importantly perhaps is the fact that a lot of the drug trade that goes on in this part of the world, the money goes through the Emirates, just like Colombia, where the president spoke about the powerful people behind the drug trade being in New York. When he said that they are not far off from the United Nations building. The people who are behind the drug trade in Latin America, and right now we see Trump bombing boat after boat, murdering innocent people from different nationalities. The real people behind this many of them are in the United States. And in our part of the world, the people behind the drug trade are largely in the United Arab Emirates, or if they're not in the Emirates, the money flows through the Emirates.
I'm glad you made that segue to Latin America, because I wanted to come to Venezuela next. Both of us are well familiar with Venezuela. We both know that we can't speak for the whole country, of course, but we are both aware that there are millions of Venezuelans who are armed and ready to fight any invasion. I find it hard to believe that Trump is going to land soldiers on boots on the ground in Venezuela, because that would be the end of his presidency. It would be marked just as Lyndon Johnson's was in the Vietnam era. It would be marked forever. He would be marked forever as the president who caused massive military casualties amongst his own armed forces. But it seems likely that they're going to start bombing, shelling the people of Venezuela. And it's difficult to see what good could come of that. It certainly will not stop the flow of refugees. It certainly will not stop the flow of drugs from Latin America to North America, because of the reasons you've just adumbrated. And the pictures will not look good either in international public opinion. What's your take as a former professor of American studies on what Trump is really up to in Venezuela?
Well, I think that if we look at what the Israeli regime is doing in West Asia and how it's trying to control West Asia, that is in the interest of the United States. If these family dictatorships in the Persian Gulf are weakened and intimidated in a way in which the United States has further control of the oil and gas wealth, and then you combine that with the oil wealth in Venezuela, that would leave the United States in a much stronger position. And it would leave China in a more vulnerable position, because China would be increasingly dependent on Russian oil. But I agree completely with what you say about Venezuela. I've been there a few times as well, and it is a beautiful country and a wonderful people, a very friendly people. There's no doubt that despite all the sanctions and the brutality of the sanctions regime, the government has a lot of support. And there's no doubt that that support comes mostly from the lower middle classes. And if the United States were to invade the country, then I think there will be enormous resistance, but also people will flow in from other parts of Latin America, and hostility towards the United States across Latin America will grow. In fact, the United States has succeeded over the years through a combination of both the sanctions and propaganda. They've succeeded in demonizing Venezuela to a degree across the continent. But now, because of the behavior of the United States and the reaction that it's getting, including, for example, from the president of Colombia, people are turning against the United States. And some of those people will join the fight. Venezuela is a part of a continent, as you rightly pointed out. It is full of, part of the Amazon forest is in Venezuela. That's how dense the forest is there, and that's the sort of, it reminds one of Vietnam, and that would be horrific for U.S. soldiers who are supposed to be occupying the country. But I do think that the Americans will probably start bombing. They will provide excuses, just like the Israeli regime does. The Israeli regime says that a soldier died. Who knows if that's how that happened? And then it slaughtered 104 people since last night, and the United States basically supported it and said, yes, there's been no violation. The president, the vice president of the United States. So when the United States can condone mass murder, the slaughter of tens of children last night, and smile and walk away, if that's what American leaders can do in West Asia, they can certainly find an excuse to start slaughtering people in Venezuela. But I think that they're not going. I don't think that the Americans are going to win this one. I think basically what they're going. This is going to be costly. Even the air campaign, having all those ships in the Caribbean is very costly. Then you're going to have people turning against you across the continent, and it's also going to strengthen the government in Venezuela because people don't like seeing people of their country being slaughtered on boats in the Caribbean without any evidence of wrongdoing. And even if there was wrongdoing, that's the Americans have no right to slaughter people like that. And people in Venezuela are obviously outraged. My friends in Venezuela, who I speak with, and you have many more friends I know, but they are confident that they will be able to overcome the challenges ahead. But it's very painful. It's very painful nowadays to watch what's going on in Sudan, in Gaza, in the Caribbean, in the Pacific. The United States is a rogue regime. It's always been a rogue regime, but nowadays it's worse than ever before. And even if the United States doesn't have any direct responsibility with regarding what's going on in the Sudan, the United Arab Emirates is a small regime closely allied to the United States and Israel. If the United States wanted this to stop, the Emirates would never stand up against Washington.
One man who is having a whale of a time, even if the rest of us are miserable, is Donald Trump. He's on this madcap tour. He's dancing in Malaysia. God knows why the people of Malaysia were encouraged by an Islamist prime minister to greet him in such a way, but they did. Then he's on board American warships, dancing to YMCA with the Japanese prime minister, looking up adoringly into his eyes. Then he's in Korea, and they're presenting him with guilt. At least it looked cheap gold to me. He seems to be on a gigantic narcissistic ego trip. He never seems to be in the United States. He never seems to be talking about the United States. He's talking as if he was the emperor of the world. But he's about to find out when he meets Xi Jinping, isn't he, that actually the emperor has no clothes.
Yes, I think that the negotiations with China will be very tough. Both you and I were recently in China. We were in the same city, but we miss each other by a few hours. I think that there will be an agreement of sorts between the United States and the Chinese. However, the scope of the agreement is something that I think is unclear so far. But I doubt that Trump will get nearly as much as he pretends that he'll be getting from the Chinese. The Chinese have the upper hand, and they've grown much more confident over the last few years about their position. I think over the last few months, in fact, they've become even more confident. After Liberation Day, when Trump announced those tariffs, and he ultimately had to back down, especially when the bond market became dangerous for the country, the Chinese smelt blood, and that has made ordinary Chinese, or at least the elites that we meet when we're there, much more confident in my view. But if we see that Trump is so arrogant and so happy, it's not because of the Epstein files, and it's not because of all the controversies at home. It is largely because of Muslim leaders. And we saw that in Egypt when we watched that monkey show, and all these regional leaders were surrounding Trump and waiting their turn to be humiliated, putting their hands on their chests to show their friendship and goodwill to this genocidal monster. So when these leaders betray the Palestinian cause the way they do, and they simply go to Cairo to please this man, and in order to get into his good book, then we should not expect anything less than the sort of behavior that we see in Kuala Lumpur or in Tokyo or in Seoul.
Well, when Gramsci said almost 100 years ago now that the new world, the old world is dying, the new world struggling to be born, we live in a time of monsters, he can't have imagined the big orange monster that would now be ruling the American empire, and still have a fair few supplicants falling around his feet. Professor Morandi, as always, a pleasure to tour the world with you. Thanks for joining us on the Mother of
Coffee. Follow me.